Alrighty, y'all. The last section of Unit 4 here is looking at these payoff matrices and game theory. So we've got two different people here. We've got Lindsay and David, and they're trying to decide whether they want to advertise their product now or advertise it later. I think where most people struggle is how to read the graph. What we're looking at, I like just to kind of pick a side. Let's say that David picks now. If Lindsay picks to advertise now, she's going to make $5,000. If Lindsay picks to advertise later, she's going to make $900. So it's just whatever side is closest to it. So the left side is closer to Lindsay, the right side is closer to David. If David were to choose to advertise later and Lindsay advertises now, she'd make $3,000. If David does later and Lindsay does later, she'd make $1,500. Now inversely, if Lindsay chose to do it now and David does it later, or David does it now, he's going to make $4,000. If David chooses later, he'd make $3,500. So the first thing it's asking us to do is define this Nash equilibrium. Nash equilibrium is when neither side has an incentive to change. Sorry, give me one moment. All right, so what we're looking at with that Nash equilibrium is if neither side has an incentive to change, right? If they can both pick an option that will always be best for them. So let's take a look at how we get to there. So if David decides to advertise now and Lindsay decides to do it later, what's David's expected profit? So David does now and Lindsay decides to do it later. So we're looking at this box. David's now, Lindsay's later. What's David's expected profit? It would be that $1,000, right? We're looking at the side that's closest to David there, would be David. So David's now, Lindsay's later, $1,000. Dominant strategy is looking at if they have an option that they would do regardless of what the other side decides to do. So if we look at Lindsay to start out with, all right, if David decided to do now and Lindsay did now, she'd make $5,000. If Lindsay decided to go later, she would only make $900. So in that case, now's better for Lindsay. If David decided to go later and Lindsay did now, she'd make $3,000. And if she decided to do it later, she would make $1,500. So she's going to go now as well. So if she's going to do now, regardless of what David does, that would be our dominant strategy. Lindsay's always going to choose now because it doesn't matter what David chooses. She'll always make more money doing it now than doing it later. So Lindsay's dominant strategy is doing it now. Now, if we're looking at David, it's going to be based on what Lindsay decides to do. If Lindsay goes now, and David does now, he makes $4,000. If he does later, he would make $3,500. So he's going to go now here. If Lindsay does later, and David does now, he would make $1,000. If David also did later, he'd make $1,800. So if what he's picking is dependent on what Lindsay's doing, if Lindsay goes now, he's going to pick now. If Lindsay does later, he's going to pick later. If what he does is dependent on Lindsay, then he wouldn't have a dominant strategy. His decision is going to be based on Lindsay's strategy. So if both owners have the information but do not actively collude, what will be the outcome? Now, it doesn't matter whether they colluded in this. They'd pick the same thing. It would be both of them going now. And the reason for that is because with this information, David knows Lindsay's always going to choose now. It doesn't matter what David does, Lindsay's going to choose now because that's where she's making the most money, right? So if David knows that Lindsay's going to choose now, he can either choose now or later. He's going to make more money going now. So in that case, if both owners have this information, even whether they're colluding or not, they're going to both choose now because that's where they're making the most profit. Now, there's a little wrench in here. Assume that the advertising company offers a deal that increases the profit for both owners by $2,000, but only if they advertise later. All right, let's change our graph now. All right, so if David chooses later here, now he can make $2,000 more. This would be $5,500. This would be $2,800. If Lindsay chose later, before her profit was $900, now it'd be $2,900. Later, instead of $1,500, it would be $2,500. Or how much more is it? 2,000. Yeah, so it'd be $3,500. So now let's look back at this dominant strategy again. So for Lindsay, we're looking at this new amount. If David chooses now, if Lindsay does now, she makes 5,000. If she does later, it's 2,900. So she's still going to go with now. If David chose later, if she does now, it's $3,000. If Lindsay chooses later, she makes $3,500. So she no longer has a dominant strategy. Her decision is going to be based on David now. And again, the reason for that is because if David chooses now, and she chooses now, she's going to make, let me backtrack on that. All right, so if David chooses now, if she chooses now, it's going to be 5,000. If she chooses later, it's going to be 2,900. Yeah. And if David chooses later, if she still chose now, she'd make $3,000. But if she chose later, she'd make $3,500. So there's not a clear-cut decision anymore on what she should do. If we look at David, no.
Okay.
If we're looking at David's dominant strategy, it's going to be based on what Lindsay decides to do. So if Lindsay decides to go now, and David decides to go now, he makes $4,000, or if he goes later, he makes $5,500. So that would be his best option there. If Lindsay chose to go, or to do it later, and he did it now, he'd make $1,000. If he did it later, he'd make $2,800. So in this case, now he does have a dominant strategy, right? No matter what Lindsay does, he's going to decide to go later here. Because again, if Lindsay chooses now, and he chooses now, he would make $4,000. But if he chose later, he'd make $5,500. So he'll choose this option. If Lindsay chooses later, and he chooses now, it's $1,000. If he chooses later, it's $2,800. So in both scenarios, he's going to choose later, so then he would have a dominant strategy in that. That's what he's going to do regardless of what Lindsay chooses to do.